Okay, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. We are so excited for you to be with us for the second webinar out of our four-part series examining research gaps related to gender-based violence among conflict-affected refugee populations in the Global South and other humanitarian contexts. My name is Beth Macklin, and I am a research specialist with the Global Women's Institute at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. I'm going to start our session with a brief introduction to our gap analysis, which is the basis for the webinar series and today's discussion, before moving on to introducing our wonderful panelists. So I'm going to share my screen again and we will get started. Our gap analysis, which you can find a link for it in the chat box, was focused on identifying research gaps on GBV among conflict-affected refugees in the Global South. The report and webinar series comes from our Building GBV Evidence program, which is funded by the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, and it seeks to strengthen the quality of GBV research in refugee and humanitarian settings. The gap analysis is just one component of this program. Another exciting aspect of the work is a technical assistance portal, which is led by my colleague Liz Heijden, who should be sharing some more information about the TA portal in the chat for anyone who's interested in learning more. For our gap analysis, we sought to fill three buckets of gaps. Population gaps, which is who is missing from the research and evaluations that we reviewed, and this is the focus of today's event. We also have knowledge gaps, which is what do we not know, what still needs to be researched, and what research questions remain. And then finally, methodological gaps, which has to do with study design, analysis, and implementation. For the gap analysis, we employed a three-step screening process where we collected publications through PubMed and Google Scholar for peer-reviewed articles. We then also collected gray literature from online repositories, as well as specific NGOs' online libraries. Finally, we did an internal GWI review with our colleagues, looking at the publications that we had collected from these sources to make sure that we can fill in any missing pieces. We then segmented these publications into two tiers. The first tier focused on publications from 2010 to 2020. It had to be focused on refugees, and it had to be focused on women and girls. Our second tier went back 20 years from 2000 to 2020, and it included internally displaced populations and also gender-based violence against other groups, such as men and boys. After completing the sorting process, we coded these based on our gap analysis framework and then analyzed and synthesized the information into four thematic areas, which are the distinct chapters within the report. And then finally, after reviewing what we do know based on the existing literature, we identified gaps and proposed recommendations for moving forward as a community of researchers and evaluators focused on this population and on the issue of gender-based violence. It's also important to note the limitations of our approach and process. We only reviewed the publications collected through our search strategy, which may mean there were other relevant papers and reports that we missed. The review only included publications that are publicly available online, which means there may be more information, particularly within NGOs' M&E portfolios that were not available for us to review. And lastly, we only reviewed English language publications, and we know there's more research and evaluations on this topic, but they were excluded due to that language piece. And so I'm now going to provide a very high-level overview of the gaps we identified related to today's topic. And if you'd like to learn more about the other gaps, please take a look at the report or join us for the next two webinars where we'll dive into the other chapters. And we also have a recording of the first webinar from the fall, which focused on ethics, equity, and power in research. And you should be able to find the link to that in the chat now. And so the basis for today's discussion is the populations gap related to inclusion and analysis. The first gap we identified is a lack of recruitment of and limited research questions related to refugee populations with marginalized or stigmatized identities, such as survivors of GBV, people with disabilities, LGBTQ plus individuals, and sex workers. And in our review, we found barely more than 5 publications for each of these groups that noted their explicit inclusion. Now, we do need to also acknowledge that for these groups, there are clear and very real risks associated with open recruitment and participation in a study that can lead to violence, social isolation, and criminalization for some, and exploitation for others. However, given the also very real and clear need to better understand these groups' experiences of GBV, exactly because they hold stigmatized or marginalized identities, we should not be using blanket ethical concerns as a universal excuse to not ask certain questions or seek out certain groups. Rather, ethics and risk assessments need to be the core consideration when defining the inclusion criteria for a study based on the specific context in which the study will be taking place. And the second gap was limited analysis that disaggregates by age groups, specifically including adolescent girls and older women. Adult women refugees were the most consistently represented group from publications we reviewed, followed by young and adolescent girls. And we found 2 issues with how these subpopulations were incorporated into analyses. The first was that the idea of girlhood and being older or elderly are culturally defined concepts. And in some cases, publications did specify age ranges for the younger group, which helps to contextualize the work. But many papers simply stated the youngest age included, usually 15 or 18 years old, and did not necessarily clarify the ceiling, though it was often 49 or 64 years old. Further, age groups were rarely separated in order to allow for a better examination and understanding of how, for example, IPV prevalence rates compare for girls, women of reproductive age, and older women. We see a clear opportunity for future work to disaggregate existing and new data by age group in order to better understand girls and older women's experiences and needs related to GBV. So these are the gaps that serve as the basis for our conversation today about 2 specific groups, older women and women and girls with disabilities, that we found were largely missing from the literature we reviewed. And before we start the presentations, I do just want to be explicit that these are not the only groups missing from the literature. This webinar is simply an opportunity to consider 2 of several marginalized groups that need to be included in our research going forward. So I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm now thrilled to introduce our speakers for today. I'm going to share short bios now, but there will be more details about our speakers and some publications in the chat. First, we have Dr. Phuong Pham, who is an assistant professor at the Harvard Medical School and Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and Director of Evaluation and Implementation Science at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. And next, we have Dr. Ingrid van der Heijden, who is a public health specialist and an independent consultant who focuses on gender-based and disability-based violence in low-middle income countries and humanitarian settings. Before I turn the floor over to Phuong, I want to share a brief note about the Q&A. As questions arise, please put them in the Q&A box and not the chat box. And if you have a question for a specific speaker, please include their name in your question to make it easier for me to moderate. Thank you everyone so much for being here. And now I am thrilled to turn it over to Dr. Phuong Pham.
Thank you, Beth. And thank you to George Washington's and Angela and Beth for, actually asking us to present this. I was actually, when we, prepared for this event, I was quite surprised that we were asked to look at older populations. It was one of the first time that we've been asked to publicly present on this particular issue. So I really appreciate the opportunity that came with this, and I think, and thank you all for coming here. It's a understudy populations and under-recognized problems too as well. And I think, a lot of the issues is due, as Beth said, there's a gap in knowledge and data on this population. So I think there's a couple of things. I'm going to present you the work that we did in 2005 and 16. It's 4 cross-sectional survey in forced displaced situations. As we know, forced displacement caused by war and
Phuong, I'm so sorry. Do you want to make your slides full screen? We can see your desktop as well.
Oh, sorry.
No worries. I just wanted to make sure that you knew that.
Okay. Okay. Can you see that now? Just a slide, or just you see the desktop and everything? Let me just stop.
We could still see the desktop.
Okay, sorry.
No, I'm sorry for interrupting.
No, not a problem. Can you see just the slide now?
Just the slide, that's perfect.
Okay, awesome. Sorry. Yeah, thank you for alerting me. Now you can see all the clutter on my computer. But just to establish some of the context, we do know that forced displacement, especially due to conflict, is a major problem worldwide. And we do know that older populations are recognized as being especially vulnerable to adverse effects of war and other forms of violence. And these populations, especially those defined as 60 and older, are accounting for more and more of the number of those who are displaced globally. I think UNHCR estimated that they represent 8.5% overall. And another established fact is that we know that in general, that older displaced persons are largely overlooked from an analytical and programmatic perspective. And then specifically on gender-based issues, older populations may be less likely to access GBV due to stigma, a lack of mobility, and lack of programming that targets this particular populations. For this particular study, we were approached by a group called Help Age and the American Advancements for Science to help them develop a study looking at this particular populations. And so this was, we conducted this in 2015. And so we, I think after a lot of consultations, we landed at, we're not going to look at the typical definitions of 60 and older, but we're going to bring it down a little bit because of the populations that we're going to look at. And so in this particular study, we defined it older populations as those who are age 49 years old or more. The younger thresholds was compared to, it's younger than I mentioned the 60-year-old threshold, but it borders the general definitions of reproductive health. So this is both trying to see if there was a gap because this population is missed by the general services provided by reproductive health, and where some of the victims of gender-based violence sometimes goes for support when they're in those settings. And we also wanted to ensure that there was a large enough number of eligible participants at each of the study sites. We worked with Health Age, but also UNHCR to select 4 study sites. And the 4 study sites were selected to represent a variety of contexts and displacement. And at each site, one camp or community was selected based on accessibility, presence of older population, homogeneity of the displaced population, like the country of origin, causes of displacement, and availability of referral service if needed. And this was a really crucial aspect in selecting the sites because we didn't want to, detect a problem without having the ability to refer them to services if needed. So in Panama, refugees were living among host populations. So this was a very difficult study. And so there we used slightly different approach. But here, as you can see, we focus on IDPs in Iraq, Colombians and Cuban refugees in Panama, South Sudanese refugees in Uganda, as well as refugees from the DRC in Uganda. So in Uganda, we had 2 sites, that one border with South Sudan and the others with the DRC. In each of these sites, we aim to interview at least 200. And as you can see here, one of the things that we did was we focused both not only, studying women, but we also included men. And then we tend to do this because we don't like to make the assumptions that one group is more vulnerable than the other, but also it allows us, when we get the data, to have a comparison group to see, how big the problem is compared to another populations. And here, so we included anyone that was elder, and to see, and you'll see that we will detect some experience among men with regard to sexual violence and intimate partner violence as well. And so here, two measures that we looked at is exposure to gender-based violence. And this was measured using 4 separate potential events in relations to conflict: being forcibly kissed, stripped naked, touched sexually, and being forced to engage in sexual relations. The focus on sexual elements of the GBV was intentional, but it is a limitation of the studies. I think there was other that we could have widened the definitions, but because of both time constraints and a couple of other limitations, we did focus on these. In addition to exposure to these individuals, we also compute a variable indicating exposure to any of these 4 events as well. Intimate partner violence was assessed among older populations with a current partner using 6 potential events that respondents may have experienced because of their spouse behavior, including being forbidden to go out, having money taken away, being cheated on, being threatened by violence, being slapped or beaten, and being raped. And this, in all of these 2 measures, both GBV and IPV, we looked at the year prior to the interview. So that's the incidents before displacement, during the conflict, and while displaced. Due to time constraint today, I will focus only on the data of the 1-year incidents, but happy to share the rest as well. So a little bit of demographic characteristic of our respondents. As you see here, that in all of the studies, you will see that we nearly had, we did in some locations, were able to capture more women than men, but we tried to get it as almost as evenly split as others. And you'll see that in Iraq, that our populations tend to be in the younger age range, between 49 to 55, so about 50%. And then we had 28% between the 56 and 65, and then 18% that was 66 plus. The other is about marital status as well. Among the men in Iraq, 100% of them are in marital status. In Iraq, you'll see that a lot of them are also, they probably are widowed. And in Panama, you'll see that we have a mixture of both currently are living or having a spouse. And we'll mention this because this will affect how we assess and the populations that was restricted, because that we looked at for intimate partner violence. So it does reduce the sample size, but because we don't ask them whether they have a spouse, when we did sample them, you don't know how many you capture when you actually study them. And so this is just one limitations that we had, that not everyone that we interview had a spouse or partner at that time. You'll see that the same situations is happening in Panama, where we do have the younger age group. However, in Uganda, in both of the contexts, the majority are in, for the South Sudanese refugees in Uganda, we had more in the 66 and plus, and then in Uganda for refugees population in DRC, in the DRC refugee populations in Uganda, you'll see that we have the majority of the population, almost half, are in the 56 to 65. So we do have some variations due to age group in the 4 contexts. And this is going to be important when we look at the data. So if you see here, looking at the 1 year prior to the interview, because we've asked them, have they experienced any of these events in the 1 year prior to the interview? So with the recall period is a 1 year time span. We did to ask them to recall before the displacement, during the displacement as well, just to get a sense of that. But I think this one is probably, the one that I have time to spend a lot today. And so and I think it's the one that I think is most telling because it's a 1 year recall period. As you can see in that the number varies, and the highest number that we detected were among the populations, the two refugee populations in Uganda. In both Iraq and Panama, you will see that about 2% of the women reported at least any one of these items. 0 for men. And so I think so there is some sort of, either it didn't exist among men, or men just weren't willing to report this. Again, this might be also among women. It might not be that it didn't exist, but they might not culturally feel, comfortable reporting these items. You'll see the same thing in Panama. Here we have about 3% of women who reported that they had experienced one of these events. And only 1% of the male felt, and specifically on the forcibly touched sexually item. However, in Uganda, you will see that about 8% of the women we interviewed reported any of the items, and pretty high percentage for men as well. And so you will see almost equally the same. And this is the same on both of the populations. I would say that on this particular, Beth, I would love your thoughts on this later on when we get to Q&A, is, I think in this particular area and this populations, GDB, especially among refugees, has been studied more. And I think maybe because of that culture, people are feel more comfortable talking about, or there's also cultural difference as well. So there might be bigger issues in these two areas, could be one explanation. Two, that people feel more comfortable responding to this type of questions because there's been prior research as well. So people feel more likely to tell the truth of what's happening. So, so there's some of that going on there. Again, we'll look like here at the incidence of IPV, very similar trend. However, for Iraq as with GBV. However, if you look at Panama, you start to see an increase, and you will see that here, men, 10% of the men in the Panama study reported that they had any one of these events that we capture for IPV. In Uganda, in both of the population, the percentage is really high, especially among women. About half of the women that we interviewed report. And again, I want to remind us that we're looking at a smaller number of individuals, so nearly half that we interviewed, because these are the half that said that they had a spouse or living with a partner as well. So you will see that there's a much higher percentage, nearly, so half of the women that we interviewed that were living with a partner had experienced some form of intimate partner violence. 17% of men reported that. And then among the DRC refugees in Uganda, you will see that 39% of the women, a slightly smaller percentage, but still a relatively large, because on some of these issues, we do tend to see them not in this range period. So a couple of summary thoughts. One thing that we walked away was that older persons displaced by conflicts are not immune to GBV and IPV. And there were important differences across sites, with older populations, persons from the sites in Iraq reporting GBV and PIV, and we discussed that a little bit. In Uganda, however, the prevalence of GBV before, during, which I didn't present, was 11% amongst South Sudanese refugee and 30% compared to 60% of, so there was a high percentage of prevalence of GBV before displacement as well. So that's just something to note that I didn't present in the data. The prevalence of GBV during displacements was lower in all three sites. So we don't see this as high when we looked at those data. Again, I didn't have the table there, but it is much lower than the incidence that I was showing. The incidence of GBV prior year ranged from 2 to 8%. So this is, in terms of lifetime prevalence, is really high, but again, incidence is 2 to 8% across all 8 sites. Implications, preventions and treatment. Results suggest older populations are affected by GBV and IPV as often as their younger counterpart. We believe a stronger concerted effort to examine and building understanding and response to such violence among the Heijden population is needed. Interventions that focus on service delivery through reproductive health mechanism will not reach these older populations who needs it. And so there is little evidence to suggest that these type of services would be appropriate. So we need to think of some other ways to reach these populations and provide services that are slightly different than what is currently offered. And despite the sensitive topic, survivors are willing to self-report. And I'm going to end it saying that there's more rooms for research to understand specific patterns of GBV and IPV that affects older populations and related risk factor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phuong. There's so much information in that presentation. I think particularly having multiple study sites across such different contexts really provides kind of a big picture understanding, but also really reinforces that context matters when we're asking these questions about both GBV and IPV. I also love the fact that you had 2 distinct measures related to both of those instead of kind of only focusing on one or lumping them all together. So I hope that we can delve into those results a bit more during the Q&A. Again, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. And now I am very happy to turn the virtual floor over to our next presenter, Dr. Ingrid van der Heijden.
Good evening, everyone. It is evening where I am. Good morning, good afternoon. Like Phuong said, thank you so much for the opportunity to present. I think this is a great opportunity to share learning and strategies for inclusion in both, in research. While my work is mostly disability specific, I acknowledge that there are additional marginal identities that intersect with disability status, and that there are missing other hidden groups that are in humanitarian settings. Including these marginal identities in research is so important, but it's a challenge. So my presentation is not disability specific. It looks more closely at the gaps and recommendations from my work that really do complement the gap analysis that Beth opened with in the webinar. I'm going to incorporate 3 pieces of my work. My research with the What Works to Prevent Violence Against Women and Girls program, my PhD work, and the recent review I've done for the International Research Commission. Next slide, please. As background evidence, women with disabilities are recognized as a marginalized group in health and development, as well as in humanitarian settings. We know the increased risk and vulnerability of women with disabilities, with them being 2 to 4 times more likely to experience violence in their lifetime. In humanitarian settings, the cycle of violence is intensified. We also know that impairment severity, age, gender, race, sexual orientation, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, refugee status, etc., interact and further marginalize women with disabilities. We also know from our work that mainstream gender-based violence prevention programs benefit all women, regardless of disability. And this we found in the What Works to Prevent Violence Against Women program evidence, using screening for and disaggregating by disability. We found that women with disabilities experience the same beneficial outcomes as other women. Next slide, please. So we know that there are ethical considerations that we need to take into account for including women with disabilities in gender-based violence research. I wrote a paper on it, although the paper was not humanitarian specific, I think that it is relevant, and that there are standards and principles for inclusion in humanitarian response. But there are no standards for inclusion in research in humanitarian settings. And that's what I would like to really look at in my presentation. For effective and impactful research, the principles of inclusion need to cover the course of the research cycle, from funding, design, data collection, analysis, and dissemination. Beyond mainstreaming protection and reducing risk, and promoting rights and inclusion standards, approaches and practices to inclusive health research don't need to be uniform, but encompass the core elements of inclusion. The participation of marginal groups and their representative organizations in the research process. Disability scholars call this co-researching, co-producing, and co-disseminating research. We also need collaborative partnerships for capacity sharing, training and resource coordination between research institutions and locally based organizations, doing ethical and safe research, and more importantly, actionable research that is socially transformative and that has a positive impact on programming and policy. Next slide, please. We must recognize invaluable guidance and recommendations for gender inclusive research in humanitarian settings, as we probably all know, published by Global Women's Institute, the What Works program, the IRC, and the WRC. These tools and tip sheets are beacons for guidance on good research practices, monitoring and evaluation, and ethics in humanitarian settings. And they do start to consider women with disabilities. However, other marginalized subgroups of refugees are largely missing, and there are methodological gaps and knowledges that remain, as the GWI gap analysis has identified. So the question is, how can academics, humanitarian agencies, and representative organizations design and implement inclusive and ethical research that can support real change for marginal groups affected by conflict and disaster? To begin this question, the IOC commissioned this review to gather technical guidance on how to ethically and equitably conduct research on health issues facing all marginalized population groups in humanitarian settings. So in the spirit of shared learning agendas, I'll be sharing these recommendations with you. The review included toolkits, quality assurance frameworks, scope of practices, fieldwork guides, and checklists for inclusion. Group representation out of the reviewed documents was highest for older persons and persons with disabilities. Even though the evidence, as both Phuong and Beth have noticed, is limited. Only 3 documents focused on gender non-conforming persons. 1 document I found on working with refugees engaged in sex work, and only 1 on non-camp urban refugees. They were, the documents were for a wide range of stakeholders, including research teams, field workers, evaluators. Tellingly, most of the violence is most of the guidance is focused on strengthening inclusion in humanitarian action or response, and not specifically humanitarian research. But I really believe that these resources can help inform inclusive research guidance. Next slide, please. So the biggest limitation in the guidance is missing identity groups such as youth, non-camp beneficiaries, refugees engaged in sex work, and refugees with differing legal statuses. Moreover, the guidance for inclusion of diverse marginal categories, i.e. older persons with disability status, younger persons with sexual orientation, differing sexual orientation, identities, is missing. This affects reliable and meaningful disaggregation of data, and a lack of using an intersectional lens to understand marginalization. So the question is, why are these groups missing? Is it due to a lack of guidance on identification and outreach, or a preference of random over purposive sampling and recruitment? The criteria of funding can often limit the resources needed to make research more inclusive. And there is an absence of dedicated funding streams for inclusion, and few incentives and mandates, affecting training and capacity strengthening of research groups to ensure that inclusion happens. The documents are lax in providing details on what inclusive methodologies work best for inclusion in humanitarian settings. And the safety and the ethical dilemmas of researching marginal groups is least considered. In addition, the review documents don't seem to tackle the limits to participation or the challenges of local ownership of research, and lacks guidance on how not to overburden participants and stakeholders when they participate as researchers and partners. Furthermore, the guidance is heavily focused on risk and vulnerability, with little recognition of the skills and agency. Sorry, I've just missed my, excuse me, of skills and agency of co-researchers. The costs are not considered. Participatory and inclusive research from what we know from the disability literature is very onerous and takes a lot of manpower. There's lack of guidance on shared dissemination and research translation. How do we do it in a more inclusive way? Is there something, how do we take dissemination and translation further than a webinar or a conference presentation or an academic published paper? There's also a lack of information or guidance on how do we ensure that the inclusive research that we do is impactful and socially transformative. I have a lot of recommendations and I'm running out of time, but there is a lot of what different stakeholders can do within different themes of academia, of academia prioritizing inclusion, diversity, promoting career pipelines of supervisors and researchers that are representative of marginal groups, institutionalizing diversity and staff training awareness on all marginal group things. I'm getting, sorry, I'm worried that I'm running out of time. We need to disaggregate intersectionality and data collection, partnerships with donors and funders. We need to really bring in the global south and representative organizations and for buy-in to research that we really have impact. We need to ask donors to provide more resources on top of program funding for inclusion. We need to ask them to broaden their inclusion mandates and incentives. Another recommendation is that we partner with organizations, we share resources and capacities and help with outreach. We do it together. I think the organizations that really represent all the persons with disabilities have ways of safely recruiting people. That there's also a problem with that. But we need to create pockets of participation. Those are the gaps that I ran through very quickly and the recommendations. In the review, I include some questions that we can ask ourselves as donors, as researchers, and as local organizations. How to interrogate what strategies we can use at different stages of research, to make inclusion something that's happening. So my takeaway messages is inclusion is not iterative. It's an iterative process. It's not a destination, and there's no silver bullet to conducting inclusive research. While there's notable guidance documents on inclusion in humanitarian programming and research, the gaps remain in advocating strategies and standards that reflect the fundamentals of inclusion. We need further work and consultations to prioritize the best inclusive research criteria to help us be accountable to the principles of impartiality and leaving no one behind. We need a cultural shift to think about inclusion early and often. There are inclusion strategies, they just need implementation. We need to learn from each other and share our experiences and not work in silos. there's a chance for us to develop community of practices and share learning and resources. This can help to fill the knowledge gap, that the gap analysis that GWI did. We need to act on recommendations and integrate lessons learned from the field on what works for inclusion and what doesn't. We need also to hold donors and ourselves accountable. We need indicators for monitoring and inclusion. Thank you. Just on time.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. You covered so much ground in that, and there were definitely things that stuck out. But right at the end, you talked about inclusion as an iterative process, and also it's something that needs to be considered early and often, which I think is a really important kind of takeaway for all of us as researchers, as evaluators, when we're thinking about study design. It's not an afterthought, but it has to be the first thought, and then thought again, and then thought again, and then thought again. I also really liked your point regarding disaggregation in order for us to better understand intersecting marginalized identities and how they inform risk of GBV, and also considering the outcomes as a result of GBV. And that's definitely something that stuck out in our gap analysis. And I just think kind of greater care with data instead of lumping groups together. And this actually relates back, Phuong, to your presentation, the fact that you had these 3 distinct age groups that allowed for a more nuanced understanding of older men and women's experiences of GBV and IPV, rather than just saying they're past the established age of reproduction, at least for women, they're older, they're all the same, we don't need to think about them as distinct groups. And we definitely saw in the data that that there are trends that we should be paying attention to. And so we have roughly 12 or 15 minutes for Q&A. And so I'm going to start us off and then go to the Q&A box. And so for people in the audience, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. And if they're for both speakers, let me know. And if they're for Ingrid or Phuong, please specify. And so the question that I'd like to start with gets at this point of intersectionality and how we apply it in our research. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we might apply these intersectional lenses to research in order to not just understand the experiences and needs of older women or women and girls with disabilities, but the experiences of older women who also have disabilities, or trans women who are also survivors of GBV, and kind of how do we actually apply that disaggregation piece, that intersectional piece, to get at these other more kind of niche populations that we know exist and that we know have great risk for violence. So I would love to start with Phuong and then go to Ingrid if that works for you too.
Thanks, Beth. And, you know, I just want to acknowledge that this is a really important work, like just looking at intersectoral work, because, you know, I think a lot of these hidden populations, they have multiple categories that makes them vulnerability, but whether by, you know, and so I think, as in any research, we do have the tools out there. We've been studying vulnerable populations for a while, so there has been methodologically tools and strategies to studying it. And I think one of the key aspects of this is actually bringing in the right subject matter expert in that one particular domain. And so that's, I think, is probably the key. And so, you know, and as Ingrid said in her presentation, partnership is also essential too. So bringing the subject matters, but also bringing in organizations or groups that are working with these populations, so that you can, you know, combine and learn from each other's and then develop the best research that you could on various disciplines. So for example, studying sexual violence among older population with disability, you could reach out to each person within that sector, people who are working solely with people with disability, people who are working in older populations, and gender, or people who are specialized in gender-based violence, or you have a combinations of one of the two or three. So I think that's how I would approach it from that type of intersectoral lens.
Thank you, Phuong. Ingrid, do you have thoughts on how kind of we apply this intersectional lens to research?
It's always at the basis of most research that I do. I think intersectionality is at the heart of research. If we really want research that responds to the lived and multiple experiences of persons, especially if they're living in conflict and they're experiencing marginalization and coming from so many different areas. Think of refugees that migrate. There's so many intersecting identities that come into play. For me, doing my intersectionality work in disability, people forget about the spectrum of disability, and I think we disregard the spectrum of people in general, and we're not doing enough. I don't think these are hidden populations. I don't like the word, because I just think we're not doing enough to really ask the right questions and get enough information to understand multiple layers of disadvantage, oppression, violence, especially in the work of GBV. And that's it's not really an answer, it's a statement.
Thank you for that. I think, again, this idea of disregarding the spectrum of people in general in so many ways. I think that's one of the challenges of research when we're trying to create something that's generalizable, that's applicable on a large scale, especially when we're thinking about how does data translate to programming. But at the same time, if we disregard the nuances of different people's experiences, we're creating programming that doesn't actually meet the needs of the people we're trying to serve. And so there's this tension, I think, between the two of those, and something that, again, it's iterative, thinking of it early and often, and how we apply that. Yeah. So I'm going to jump into the Q&A box now. And so, Phuong, we have two questions for you. So one was related to your measure of IPV, and said that one of the questions was about being cheated on, and we would like to hear more about the inclusion of that event as part of IPV. And you can perhaps see all of the details, but the question of why was that included in IPV, and exactly kind of what that tells us.
Yes, as I mentioned at the beginning, that we did this in partnerships with our partners, and there was a lot of qualitative research that was done prior to us actually doing this quantitative. And I think that's the other thing that we don't mention is about, especially when we study these hidden populations, before you jump into, especially on the populations where there's not that much data, you do a lot of qualitative research. And I think this was brought to bear during our discussions of what to include into IPVs. And so I think when we were brought in, we do a lot of mixed method, but our strength is in the quantitative aspects. And so this was brought to our attentions. And I think some of the rationale for that was also linked a lot to physical violence. So the people who commit physical violence or adulteries is also some of the people who commit physical violence or cause mental distress with spouse. And so we were trying to take one that could, capture that, especially when people do not feel comfortable reporting some of the harder mental distress or some of the more sensitive questions. So this was just a kind of like a way to assess it indirectly, but also allow the respondents to feel comfortable responding. So I think that was really based on that. I think this the other questions about I see in the chat deals with religion as and yes, I do believe that could have came to play. And I mentioned that, and I single out Iraq. There are cultural and religious norm that do come to play with people comforts to self-reports experiences with sexual violence. So that is probably could be one of the explanation.
Great, thank you. And we have another question that's for both Phuong and Ingrid, and it gets at the issue of sextortion as a form of GBV and humanitarian response. Perhaps if you know of anything related to the specific populations you presented on today of this form of GBV in terms of services for refugee populations or access to services, including water and sanitation.
I can go first.
Sure.
Maybe. I literally had to Google what that meant. In our GBV research in multiple low middle income countries, this has never been measured as a form of sexual violence. So I don't really have much to say on that. I think it's becoming more and more of an issue in our day-to-day reality because of social media, etc. But yeah.
Beth, I was going to turn that to you because I think that's something you did a systematic review and a gap analysis. What did you see? I think that is important to learn from your work as well.
So for the gap analysis that we did, we specifically excluded research focused on sexual exploitation and abuse, in part because GBV and SEA are largely considered kind of different issues in the field of humanitarian response, and so that is not something that that we specifically included. So I also can't speak much to this issue. However, other colleagues at the Global Women's Institute have done quite a bit of work, and so if anyone who is in the event would like more resources related to this, you can follow up with an email to in response to the Zoom event, or to reach out to the Global Women's Institute, and we could share some additional resources there that speak to sexual exploitation and abuse and humanitarian response. And so we are right at 10 o'clock, and so that is the end of our time. I want to say thank you so much to Phuong and Ingrid for your time, your expertise, for being with us today for this event. I think this was such an important conversation, and you've given us so much to think about in our research going forward. I also want to thank everyone from the Global Women's Institute that helped make this event possible. And then lastly, everyone who has joined us, we're grateful that you're part of this community. If you want to learn more about the Building GBV Evidence program, there's a link in the chat for you to check out. And please be on the lookout for our next webinar, which will be later in the spring. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.